What's good? It's Woog. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel if you were into the fight talk. I just wanted to give pretty much my earliest of thoughts on the Devin Haney versus George Kambosos rematch, which was just made official for October 15th in Melbourne, Australia. Devin Haney just won all of the belts. He was already the WBC champ, and then he won the other belts off of George Kambosos after Kambosos had unexpectedly won those belts off of Teofimo Lopez, after Teofimo Lopez unexpectedly won those belts off of Vasily Lomachenko. So that's pretty much been the path of those titles outside of Devin Haney again for a couple years holding the WBC belt. Aside from obviously the designation of franchise champion on the WBC side that was supposed to be non-transferable. We're not going to get into that conversation, but Devin Haney just won the belts off of George Kambosos and thereby kind of became the made man at 135 lightweight. And obviously, going into this rematch, the idea is, well, rinse and repeat. Devin Haney is just that much better than George Kambosos. He's going to outclass him like he did in the first fight. Well, I think that this is another one of those cases where, although you would have to favor Devin Haney, let's not forget what the stakes were going into that first fight and what the overall public sentiment was. I mean, the public was pretty split on who they thought was going to win it. Yes, most people felt like Devin Haney overall was the better boxer, but there was also the question of, well, whose hands are quicker, being how we saw George Kambosos perform against Teofimo Lopez, who clearly came in with the wrong game plan. But George Kambosos, nonetheless, looked very good in that fight against Teofimo Lopez. And, you know, going into Kambosos versus Haney 1, it's almost like we forgot that there was a lot of question on who was going to come out on top there. Now, after we saw the fight play out, now it's like the public sentiment has totally switched overnight to where it almost became a, well, of course Devin Haney was going to win. Look at how much better his complete skill set is than George Kambosos. Well, no, we thought, or a lot of us actually thought, that George Kambosos was going to make this a very close fight. And then when you factor in the potential home cooking on the scorecards, well, who knows? Maybe if this looks like a very even fight, that the judges in Melbourne, given the crowd noise and everything like that, we're going to go George Kambosos' way, which they almost did. Like, this fight on the scorecards was way closer than it should have been. Most people who saw the fight didn't feel like Kambosos won more than 2, maybe 3 rounds, but the scorecards were much, much closer than that. So yeah, if this did end up being a somewhat close fight, given the judging that we eventually saw, yeah, it was very conceivable that George Kambosos would have been awarded a decision win in a fight that even to our eyes, Devin Haney might have pulled off. Well, Devin Haney, again, won this one by a landslide to our eyes, but the judging suggested a much closer fight than that. So again, I think that there's like a recency bias in the same way that we kind of had going into the second fight with Usyk versus Joshua 2, where because of the nature of the first fight, we almost forgot what the expectation was going into the first fight, which was most people more or less believing that Anthony Joshua was going to beat Alexander Usyk. Now, 2 fights later, we know better. So, should we expect this rematch to look like the first fight? Should it look even more pro-Haney? Like, is Haney going to get even more confident in throwing more power punches and sitting on more of his punches than in the first fight? Or is it going to look more like a lot of us expected the first fight to look before the first fight actually happened? I tend to think it's usually somewhere in the middle. Like, look, again, obviously, we will more or less expect Haney to win the fight. But look, I've seen too much boxing to naively go into this rematch just expecting it's going to be more, basically that we're going to start off with round 13 between these two. Are we to think that there are no adjustments that Kambosos can make in this rematch that can make things a little bit more interesting? You know, I mean, Haney was able to largely control the first fight behind a jab. Do we think that Kambosos is going to succumb to the jab in the same way that he did in the first fight? Look, again, I have seen too much of the unexpected to just assume walking into this rematch that we are going to get the same George Kambosos that we got in the first fight, which again, yeah, it was pretty shocking. Well, shocking isn't the word, but it was stunning because of how high the stakes were for Devin Haney and how important it was for him to not only edge, but to demonstratively win the fight, to reliably get the scorecards, get the love from the judges, right? So he had to go into enemy territory where you knew the crowd was going to be super raucous, and he had to just perform his butt off, right? And which he totally did. So I almost feel like we kind of have to hit the reset a little bit expectations-wise, because even the Australian crowd doesn't think that this rematch was warranted. Like when Kambosos activated the rematch clause, you know, there was kind of a collective sigh and a collective groan where it was like, do we really need this rematch? Well, the idea that we don't need this rematch versus what is actually going to play out in the rematch, those are two different things. No, I don't think that the first fight merited a rematch, even though it was contractually agreed to. So I don't think that this rematch is totally warranted. But that doesn't mean that we can automatically assume that we know what we're going to get in the rematch. You get what I'm saying? There's a distinction between whether the rematch is warranted and whether Haney versus Kambosos 2 is going to play out like Kambosos versus Haney, the first fight. So there are a couple variables here, and some of those are sort of intangible. Like, is Devin Haney going to be as dialed in and determined as he was in the first fight? Now that he's had 12 rounds with George Kambosos, might he potentially sleep on George Kambosos' ability to make adjustments, for instance? Now, I have seen no indication that Devin Haney will treat this fight unprofessionally. He seems to be a total professional. He seems to be pretty, wise beyond his age, actually. And he seems to be more mature than his age. It's kind of interesting and pretty admirable. So I have no evidence to think that Devin Haney is going to sleep on the task at hand here and the importance that he performs as well as he did in the first fight. I don't have any reason to think that he won't. But again, this is just a variable. Also, what kind of adjustments should we expect Kambosos to make? And I think that this part is the part where we might be sleeping on it a little bit because of how seemingly easily Haney was able to outbox Kambosos and how few adjustments Kambosos was making round after round in that first fight. It's like, damn, you're not going to do anything different from rounds 7 through 12 than you were doing in rounds 1 through 6. It was kind of disappointing in the lack of adjustments that we were seeing out of Kambosos. But again, that doesn't necessarily mean that we should get the same Kambosos in this rematch. So again, my early instinct is to go Haney in this rematch. By the way, the narrative that came out of that second fight was Haney's legs, right? His ability to control distance, which we knew a lot of these things going into the first fight, but we didn't know how much it was going to be noticeable in terms of the skill gap and the physicality and athleticism gap between these two, right? We didn't know that it was going to be that obvious in the first fight. I thought that most of us expected a much closer fight. Well, we didn't get a close fight, but that shouldn't automatically make us assume that this rematch is not going to be a close fight. That's all I'm saying. So I'm going to issue out a full preview as we near the fight date. I just want to caution us, the boxing audience and the boxing fans, just given what we've seen in terms of expecting the unexpected in some of these scenarios, not to just assume flat out that Devin Haney is going to dominate the second fight in the way that he did the first fight. Hell, I thought that I was about to see, Emmanuel Navarrete lose and potentially get stopped by Eduardo Baez last weekend before he turned things around with that devastating body shot. So, look, I've seen too much boxing to feel like I know better and that I already have a beat on things. Yes, I do think I have a inclination on what to expect in this rematch. Again, Haney has great legs, and obviously his jab is one of the best in the sport. So that might indeed rule the day in this rematch. I just think that we have to take into account what the potential adjustments Kambosos can make in this rematch to make it a lot more competitive than in the first fight. Just in the same way that we were looking at the adjustments that Anthony Joshua would have to make in the rematch against Usyk to make that fight more competitive. So I'm going to ask you guys, what do you think are some of the adjustments Kambosos can make in the rematch to make it a lot more competitive? Let me know what you think about that in the comments. I mean, I feel like he could be a lot more physical than he was in the first fight, which you could argue whether that would work for or against him, given the idea that perhaps Haney is just that much more physical than Kambosos, as well as being a more complete and gifted all-around boxer. But there's also the idea that Kambosos can lead a lot more in this rematch rather than trying to respond to the jab and throwing, the right hand over the jab, because that really wasn't working. But also throwing, 2 to 3, 4 punch combinations rather than just the one or maybe a 1-2 for Kambosos. There are different things that he could, try to implement in this rematch, but I just wanted to issue this initial video to ask us to kind of pump our brakes on assuming that we know what's going to play out in the rematch, because this was a case. I think in terms of the narratives that are playing out right now, there is some recency bias based on how lopsided that first fight was. But again, I just want us to try to perhaps reset our mind to how it was before the first fight took place, because we did think that it was going to be a lot more competitive than it was, and that was because of a lot of what we saw from George Kambosos, especially in that fight with Teofimo Lopez. Now, granted, Kambosos' fights against Mickey Bey and against Lee Selby before that had us thinking Teofimo Lopez was just going to whoop up on George Kambosos. And a lot of us, I'm sure, believe that if Teofimo Lopez was closer to his true self, strategy-wise and just in his headspace, just implementing a better game plan, that he would have been victorious over George Kambosos. But I just don't want us to overnight, given the one fight between Kambosos and Haney in that first fight, for us to reform our opinion on George Kambosos from being a formidable opponent and a threat to beating Devin Haney to, well, who the hell is George Kambosos? Which is where we just adjusted our perceptions and our opinions to after that first fight. It's almost like we've had such drastic changes in opinion over George Kambosos' abilities before the Teofimo Lopez fight, and then after the Teofimo Lopez fight going into the Devin Haney fight, and then in the wake of Kambosos versus Haney 1. We've had these swings of opinion on George Kambosos. So I feel like there's going to be somewhat a middle ground. It's just going to be interesting, and we're going to discuss this going down the line, what some of the adjustments Kambosos can make in this rematch are, and also what kind of Devin Haney we should expect in this rematch. And is he going to be even more demonstrative? And is the gap going to be even wider in this rematch? There are a few possibilities here. I just want us to keep an open mind to a multitude of scenarios and not just the, hey, we saw what we needed to see in that first fight. Even though, again, I wasn't happy that they made this rematch. I wanted to see Devin Haney fight some of the other, seemingly very good or perhaps even great fighters at 135, So I wasn't like thrilled about the idea of this rematch, but that doesn't mean, again, it doesn't mean that I know what's going to take place in the rematch. But yeah, let me know what you think in terms of your earliest thoughts on Devin Haney versus George Kambosos 2 in the comments. And please like the video, subscribe to the channel if you were into the fight talk. I'm Woog. Thanks for tuning in.